Well, hello, and thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me to give this talk, which will be another talk about communication. And I feel very humbled because I know that loads of you have done loads of very good communicating, but I hope that I can still say some things that are interesting to all of you. And also Kevin gave a really interesting talk already on Monday about communication. So what I'm hoping to do is reinforce some of the things that he's already said, and maybe be a bit more specific and give some sort of more practical tips on how you might go about communicating to an audience that isn't sort of your immediate academic neighborhood. So I don't have a background in epidemic modeling or even in modeling or in statistics. Many years ago, I was a pure mathematician. And then about 20 years ago, I had a career change and I became one of the editors of, and this doesn't work, so I'll try that. Doesn't work either. Well, I keep on talking while I try to make the slides work. I became one of the editors of something called Plus magazine. Here we go. Yay. So Plus is a website, a free website, that publishes content about all areas of mathematics aimed at a variety of non-expert audiences. I edit Plus together with Rachel Thomas, here she is, who some of you already know. And we both produce most of the content that is on Plus. So we write most of the articles and we produce most of the podcasts that are there. Plus is part of something called the Millennium Mathematics Project. It's an outreach and educational initiative based next door here at the CMS. And we have the great pleasure and privilege and honor to have Julia Gorg as our director. And Julia has done some amazing work with the MMP over the years because the link goes back a long way. And it's well worth looking up if you haven't seen that before. So Plus works through collaborations. So for example, we have a collaboration with the Newton Institute and the Newton Gateway, reporting on the work that goes on here. But crucially for this talk, we also have a collaboration with the Juniper Partnership, which I hope that most of you know what it is. Started out as the Juniper Consortium of Modelers, and we were on board since the beginning, at the start of the pandemic. And I had a quick count earlier, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that we've already published more than 50 articles, I think, as part of this collaboration, and about 10 podcasts. So yeah, what I want to do today is give you some sort of tips or insights that I've gained through my own personal experience and that I've learned from other really good communicators, such as David Spiegelhalter or John Barrow, who used to be Julia's predecessor as director, or Julia herself, actually. And before I start, I just want to give a quick plug to communication more generally, because even if you have no intention whatsoever to communicate with anybody outside your field, it's always worth thinking about good communication, okay? Because nobody wants to work hard to understand what you're saying, whether it's a PhD supervisor, somebody interviewing you for a job, I don't know, reading your grant application, all the way up to the general public. So it's worth thinking about good communication. So don't switch off, please. Okay, so if you do want to communicate with somebody who's not in your immediate field, what are some of the main things to keep in mind? Well, the first thing, and it's really one of the few hard and fast rules, and Kevin has already said it, but it cannot be stressed enough, is that you have to think about your audience. That's absolutely crucial. And it's kind of difficult to do though, so how do you do it? Well, the best way of doing it is to find a guinea pig, if you can at all. Find somebody who is in some way similar to the kind of audience you're going to be talking to and test your ideas out on them. Okay, so you've come up with an explanation for a difficult concept, try it on a guinea pig and see what happens. I do it all the time, and then I realize that I'm kind of failing all the time because I think I have a great explanation for something. I say it to my friends over dinner, they glaze over, I have to start again. So that's really the best way of doing it. If you can't find a guinea pig because there's no one around, there's only non-guinea pigs around, you don't have time, make one up, visualize them, and talk to them aloud. Talking aloud is great because it really changes your own perception of what you're saying. And one of the main points of this, of course, is to try to understand the language that your audience speaks, because that is absolutely crucial in weeding out this horrible thing called jargon. Now, it's kind of obvious that we shouldn't be using technical jargon when speaking to people who don't know it. So you're not going to say to the person next to you on the bus, I don't know, age-stratified SEIR model or something. They're going to get a fright. You're not going to say that. But then there's also, less obvious jargon. Classically, the word significant means something very different to a statistician than it does to a, I almost said normal person, to the person next to you on the bus. The word model is jargon, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well. So really crucial to try to get a sense of your audience's language and adjust to that. Next thing, very obvious but still tricky sometimes, is try to figure out what do they already know and what do they not know. So we had a quick conversation this morning with Julia and James, I think, about how some people, or a lot of people will not feel very familiar with the idea of counting people in non-integer numbers, okay? Averages. That's weird to people. So think about that carefully. Are they familiar with such concepts? We had a discussion, or you guys had a discussion in the panel, I think it was, about randomization and the value of it, that we can learn from it. This is not something that people outside the maths, stats, science community know. And as somebody rightly pointed out, they could be horrified, feeling that they're being randomized and their choices taken away. So really important to try, I know it's hard, but really important to try and get a sense of which concepts do you actually need to explain and which can you just take for granted. Now, I also have a don't here, which relates to that concept of trustworthiness that Kevin already talked about. If your communication involves if trust could be an issue, then you need to earn that trust. And it's been shown in studies that intent is an important aspect of how communication is perceived or received. If somebody senses that your intention is to persuade them of something, you might lose them. That undermines trust. So David Spiegelhalter has a slogan that I think he has on a T-shirt, or at least he said he'd like to have it on a T-shirt, which is inform, don't persuade. Give people the evidence, but don't nudge them. Similarly, don't dismiss obvious questions and concerns out of hand. And you might find those questions and concerns when you do a guinea pig conversation. And you might not want to address them because maybe you think they're silly, maybe you don't know the answer, but that can undermine trust if you just ignore them as well. Within reason, because I've had many discussions with conspiracy theorists that I wish that I hadn't had. But within reason, see that if you can address concerns and and questions. Next thing I wanted to say is, do not assume that people know what a model is. Now, that is audience dependent. You might be talking to audiences that know very well what a model is, but generally people out there really, really don't know what a model is. So always consider including some form of an explanation. It could be a very vague, high-level explanation like what I've put up there. I think we have that on plus somewhere. But also tap into what people do know, because the vast majority of people do not do mathematical modeling, but most of us do some form of calculation. We might be projecting into the future. Maybe it's to do with our savings. Think about a bit of uncertainty, parameters. These things are familiar to people. So tap into that knowledge that is already there and make a link to it. I put manage expectations. What I meant by this is sort of maybe let people into the process of what it means to build a model, so that they don't feel that models are something that magically drop from the sky and then magically give you some answer that you could either run away from because you don't want to believe it, or you think is, this is exactly what's going to happen. But, maybe give them a sense of that what you're doing is something quite natural, which is gathering all the information that is relevant that you have, assembling it, putting it together using the language of mathematics, using data, in order to arrive at the best possible answer to a particular question, or at least an answer that's better than a guess. Again, it's a natural process, only it's not so natural to people once the maths comes in, but still, it's something that people are familiar with. So what you're building isn't perfect, it's going to be wrong, but it might be very, very useful. Another thing I wanted to say is zoom out, and this really applies to to the communication of anything that's difficult or complex. Don't get caught up in the details, because it might be very interesting to you what kind of model you're dealing with. Is it a network model, or is it an agent-based model, or is it an SIR model, or whatever? Do people really need to know that, though? This could confuse things vastly if they don't understand what these things are. So kind of take that really detailed and technical picture that makes sense to you and all your peers, and just try to zoom out until you hit that critical point where things come into focus for your audience. Easy to say and kind of hard to do, but it's important to kind of try to find that right distance to the picture for it to make sense to people. Related to that is perhaps consider exploring a toy model. Again, this was discussed earlier in the week, I think, the merits of that, especially in terms of communication. And I mean, there's a great example, like, I don't know if you've seen Julia Go's Christmas lecture, for example, where you literally turned it into a toy, as in it was a game, an interactive game with the audience. And that has now been turned into resources for schools that sit on some of our websites. That is a really interesting and interactive way for people to engage with the model and understand what is happening. Now, obviously, you don't want to play, you're not always in a situation where turning something into a game is the appropriate thing to do. But depending on your audience, maybe you still want to make a simpler model than what you actually work with, so that you can walk them through it and so that they can really understand how different things relate to each other. And also that might give you the possibility, even if you're not an expert in creating interactivities or visualizations, so I'm going to stay away from visualizations because Nick is in the audience. But even if you're not an expert, like me, I'm not an expert, but if you've got something simple enough, you can use something simple like Desmos to knock up an interactivity, maybe where you can change parameters and allow people to explore what's happening there. So that's worth considering. And the last thing I really wanted to mention, because we cannot not mention is uncertainty. Now, obviously, well, it's obvious to us, maybe don't hide uncertainty, but we also all know, and Kevin already said it, that it's not taken account of enough really in the mainstream media. And I mean, there's good reasons for that, and it's been shown repeatedly in studies with people that people are averse to ambiguity. They do not like ambiguity. But there's also work done that was done by the people from the Winton Center for Risk and Evidence Communication next door here, which is now closed, which found that if you do present people with a number and some uncertainty, that does not significantly undermine their trust either in the number or in you or the people who produce that number. So people can cope with the idea that there is uncertainty. So that is not an excuse to hide it, that they can't cope with it. The problem is how to present it to them. And that's a very difficult and complex field, and there's lots of work done on it. And I'm kind of glad I'm running out of time because there's no way I could give a comprehensive sort of explanation of that. But just a few points is, maybe it's obvious, like be specific about what is uncertain and why it's uncertain. Because uncertainty stresses people out, and you don't want to put them in an emotional state where they get so freaked out that they just don't want to engage with that at all because they think nothing is known and everything is uncertain. Interestingly, even though it's well documented that people can find dealing with numbers tricky, when it comes to uncertainty, only describing it in words is no good either, because there's a lot of variability in how people interpret these words. So you can say to somebody something is likely and they'll translate that to a 60% chance. Maybe somebody else will take it as a 30% chance. There's a lot of variability. Also, interestingly, apparently it's cumulative as well. So apparently if somebody gets told by 3 different sources that something is likely, they will add them up and say it's very, very, very likely. So that can happen. So again, that's a good reason to, use words by all means, but make sure there's also a number, a percentage, a range or something attached to it. Quantify, of course, if you can quantify the effect of the uncertainty, then do, which can be very tricky, and it can be very tricky to think about how to explain this, but if you can find a way, that's best. And also obviously say what your work can't do. Sometimes it's stating the obvious, because to you it might be very obvious that your work is about making a short-term prediction, about making scenarios, about doing something else. But just make sure you state that so that it's absolutely clear that people know what your work is doing and therefore also what it can't do. So I am now almost out of time, but I'm going to spend the last kind of couple of minutes advertising something. So as Kevin said on Monday already, there was an amazing meeting here at the Newton Institute I think it was in January 2023, organized by the Newton Gateway along with Kevin and Tom King. It was called Communicating Mathematics for the Public. And it was a total eye-opener. I've never seen people from so many different areas of having to communicate maths and data science and stats coming together, and there was so much expertise there. So Rachel, my co-editor, and I were inspired by this to apply for an I&I network grant. And we've now set up the Math SciComm network. It started off earlier this year. We've had a few informal Zoom meetings, and we're planning an in-person workshop here at the Newton Institute in November. And we want to focus on evidence, because even though there's some great work regarding visualization, for example, or regarding the communication of risk, when it comes to what kind of communication works more generally, there's kind of a bit of a black hole of evidence. So we'd like to focus the workshop on that, to just kind of map out the landscape. So anybody amongst you who's interested in communication, who's doing it, who would like to do it, who's experimenting with new ways of doing it, or with evaluating it, or anything like that, please consider joining. There's a link at the bottom that takes you to a page with more information and also joining information. But I'll also put that in the Slack, so that hopefully you can have a look at it and join up. Finally, I got a few references, which Kevin already had a few, so I haven't repeated them. I'll also put all of this in the Slack in case you want to see it. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Do you have some questions? Or comments?
Yes. Sometimes you have to communicate uncertainty with people who are making decisions and they don't want to know how much you should go about pointing out that uncertainty.
When people don't want to engage with it?
Yeah, because making decisions maybe don't really want to worry too much about the uncertainty.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, probably some people in the audience would be better probably have been in that position. I mean, what I would say from my experience is, just point out and go back to pointing out that this uncertainty is a natural thing. It's not something that only inconveniently exists in this one subject that you need to make a decision on. But, it's always there, and we always somehow need to take account of it. But it's a good question. I mean, somebody else maybe can say more about that.
Another question? If not, we'll thank Marianne again.